here tonight. We're privileged to have a speaker who has actually been here a couple days as a part of a conference, the last three network conference, first national conference of that grouping that was actually held here in this auditorium this weekend. And lots of literature still up there in the back. I guess people can peruse that right afterwards if they're interested in buying any of it or looking at any of the literature from the conference. Even got some information on the board there about the workshops and activities that went on. But tonight's lecture will be by a distinguished person who I've a number of years have wanted to have come to Ames, and we were able to arrange that. And tonight he'll be presenting a lecture on ecology, social ecology. And he is probably the foremost expert on that, having been the author of numerous books, including Remaking Society and The Ecology of Freedom. He's from Burlington, Vermont, and he's associated with the Institute for Social Ecology in Burlington, Vermont, which anybody who hasn't received one of the brochures can receive a brochure about the Summer Institute. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for the night, and he'll tell you how he's going to go about this. Let's make it kind of informal. Our speaker for the night is Murray Bush.
Question, please, if it's okay with you. How many people have ever read my, this is sort of the usual suspects. How many people have actually read any of my writings, like The Ecology of Freedom, or Post-Facet Anarchism? Can you give me a show of hands if you haven't? Do you have read? Yeah. The majority of you, aside from the usual suspects, have not. Okay, thank you. What I'd like to do then, I think, is to open the discussion, more of a discussion in the lecture if possible, by giving you an overview of a book I read some years ago, called The Ecology of Freedom. And then afterward, see if we can develop some kind of discussion amongst ourselves in a very small group and do it informally and practically as possible. Okay? Is that agreeable to most people? I think I should give you some idea of my own background. I've been involved in the ecology movement. Actually, I can't even call it a movement, I should say. I've been involved with the problems of ecological breakdown of our planet. Let's make it nice and sweeping. Since 1952. What this basically means is that I've been involved in the issue of pesticides, agricultural chemical fertilizers, as they used to be called, biocides, speak of soluble nitrogen generally in soil form that was being used on farms and the possible effect this could have on groundwater and the possible dangers of nitrogen for general topic. In fact, the language, all of this might very well affect the nitrogen cycle. That whole vast biogeochemical cycle that is structured around nitrogen. I dealt in a study about 2 years later, I dealt in a pamphlet with the possibility that carbon dioxide, the ratio of carbon dioxide to oxygen in the atmosphere might increase to a point where 2, 3, or 400 years from now, we would begin to witness climatic changes. We call that the greenhouse effect. And I thought I was being very far out. I thought I was really going crazy. 600 new chemicals going into the environment that were basically untested or could not be tested until a few generations ago. What would be the impact, for example, on fetuses? Not to speak of the fact that many cancers do not finally, as it were, occur or surface clinically until about 10, 20, or 30 years goes by of exposure. And these things really shocked me, and at that point I remember too, about 6 months later, Rachel Carson came out with Silent Scream and pointed out particularly the dangers of pesticides and what that probably reached millions of people. Well, I have never felt that I've been more restrained in my life after some 60-odd years of radicalism. Everything that I worked with at that time was conservative. It was almost ridiculous. And in fact, the most grimmest predictions that I made for hundreds of years from now are effects that are being felt today. First, we are not throwing 600 new chemicals in any longer if we were throwing in that small amount into the environment. We're throwing in 30,000. And it's in every conceivable way, it's permeating our entire planet. DDT now, or just generally the fluorinated hydrocarbons, of which DDT is an example, used in pesticides, used in cleaning fluids, used in an endless array of industrial products, as well as consumer products, are now so worldwide that they have to dig into glacial ice in the Arctic in order to find chlorinated hydrocarbon-free samples. Because as far as Antarctica, in the most remote regions of the planet today, many of these toxicants have already become part of the food web. There is no place, frankly, that has been spared any longer, unless you literally start looking into, going literally into paleontology and start digging into the ice caps and going down to ice that was formed thousands of years ago or even hundreds of years ago. But today, everywhere, we find the chlorinated hydrocarbons, we find lead. We didn't know what PCBs were when I was writing in 1952 and in fact in 1962. The polychlorinated biphenyls, we didn't know what they were. They're all over the place. The lead has become a problem of immense proportions today, and it's almost taken for granted that everybody carries far more lead in his or her body than probably is in any real sense of the word quite safe, assuming that any amount of it is safe aside from trace elements. We find today that we are not only poisoning the planet, polluting it, but what we're also doing is simplifying it. And this is one of the most important points I'd like to stress in our early writings. We're simplifying it. What we're doing basically is we're taking fairly complicated ecological systems or ecosystems that have been millions of years of evolution, becoming more and more complex as life crept out of whatever primal oceans it was in, and gradually colonized the mineral world by and large, producing soil and finally producing plant life and producing a great variety of species. However much many of them have been extinct, have become extinct over time. Still, a countless number of varieties and species that are essential, in my view, for maintaining the balance of the planet, diversity being so important world found itself millions and even billions of years ago. We're turning soil into sand. Soil that has been thousands of years in the making. And essentially, we're producing a landscape, if you want to speak of soil, is virtually a sponge, and little more than a sponge, for fairly liquid or fairly simple fertilizers, synthetically made fertilizers. We're polluting our oceans on an incredible scale. The Valdez experience that is occurring right now up in Alaska is only an example, a dramatic example of what's going on to a lesser degree, but added up to a far more significant degree than anything that occurred in the Alaskan waters throughout most of our oceans. Our streams are turning into sewers. Lake Champlain, where I live, which is perhaps the fifth largest lake in North America, and which supplies us with our water, is known to be very heavily polluted with all kinds of exotic chemicals, some of which cannot be filtered out. They're just much too much a part of the system, and the technology for filtration, for aeration, and so on and so forth, the even tertiary treatment of these waters does not match the exotic nature of the chemicals that reach us. And I refer to such things as radionuclides, such that in Vermont, a state that is the most rural in the United States, one of our cities has one of the highest cancer rates in the country, and Vermont, a rural area, with comparatively no industry, if you look at other states, has an above than average cancer rate, due in great part, we suspect, to water pollution. So we are running into problems now where we are simplifying the planet. We're cutting down forests that have been around for 60 million years. I refer to the great rainforests, literally disappearing except for small patches that might be preserved as reserves. Antarctica is even polluted significantly. And not only are we doing that, we are obviously, as everyone knows, changing the ratio of carbon dioxide to oxygen in the air. And in doing so, incidentally, I would like to stress this. The ozone effect, if I may call it that, in addition to the greenhouse effect, in which a large area of the ozone layer has been so thinned out as to emit serious quantities of ultraviolet radiation, on our planet, threatens not only to increase the incidence of serious skin cancers such as melanoma, and that's one of the most aggressive cancers around. It also threatens to reduce the reproductive activity of phytoplankton in the ocean, which may be responsible for 80% of the oxygen that we find in our atmosphere today. When one assembles this entire picture, one has to ask very basic questions. One has to go beyond the idea of Margaret Thatcher that we should have some conferences and we should get together to do something about it. And begin to ask ourselves, what are the basic causes of this? It's not enough to talk about how we're going to reduce certain effects. I have complete sympathy with people, and I have inspired movements of people who have tried, for one thing, to arrest the proliferation of nuclear reactors, which is as frightening as the proliferation of nuclear bombs. I've been in the Clanshell Alliance in the 1970s as an activist, one of the largest anti-nuclear alliances in the United States during that time, which mobilized tens of thousands of people and gained national headlines because of attempts to obstruct the building of a large nuclear reactor in Seabrook, New Hampshire. I've been involved locally, as I told you. I was also, as I even alluded, I should have said, to the fact that I helped stop the building of the nuclear reactor, the world's biggest nuclear reactor, in 1962 inside New York City. Not outside, inside, in Manhattan. Or more precisely in Queens, right across from the United Nations. I've been involved in efforts to stop highways in Vermont right now. There are attempts to build what they call a Southern Connector, which may bring in more traffic into the city and will be a major four-lane highway. And so I applaud all the efforts that are being made. by various organizations, each one dealing and trying everywhere along the line to deal with a specific issue. That's important. Try to stop these things. Try to put a brake on these things. And in fact, as a Green involved in activities in northern Vermont, I was deeply concerned with questions of growth in our organization, running people for mayor and alderman, raised questions of growth, which incidentally opens up a whole series of questions. Should we have a moratorium on growth? On what kind of growth? In addition to that, who's going to decide what kind of growth? Will it be the state? Will it be the locality? Or will it be the federal government? Or what? And coming from town meeting country, as you may know about Vermont, will it be grassroots democratic organizations that will decide the kind of growth Vermont will have? So all these problems which people are trying to deal with, what I would call these environmental problems, are problems that should be confronted everywhere along the way. We need anti-nuclear alliances or anti-nuclear groups. We need people who try to monitor poisons in our food and the exposure of farmers to a tremendous array of chemical hazards that is far more dangerous for them than even the consumers of farm products. A point I incidentally made in a good deal of my writing because of my own interest in agriculture and different forms of agriculture. All of these things have to be handled. I agree. But let us not deceive ourselves. The most we are doing is trying to hold the brakes on an accelerating machine that is going downhill. And we have to make a very important decision. Admit it, we have to break it. We have to hold it back. We have to reduce its momentum, the speed at which it's going today at an ever-accelerating rate. And our lives are very much at stake today. And the lives particularly of younger people. I'm beginning to see people dying from cancer, personal friends at the age of 30 or 40. Diseases that years ago were really regarded as so-called degenerative diseases that came at least with ages beyond 60 years. I'm beginning to see incidences of cerebral hemorrhages in people in their 20s. A thing almost unknown, at least for the medicine of my day in the 1930s, and believe it or not, we were not that trained. We did know when somebody died of a cerebral hemorrhage, or had a cerebral hemorrhage, or had a stroke. Those things were quite visible or quite plain. And we hardly heard of anyone having any of these conditions in their 20s, and now it's become very widespread. A study done with Korean War post-mortems on their hearts and on their vascular system showed that an enormous percentage of them were on the point of having coronary attacks. And that was partly explained, it could have been explicable as a result of stress, although having some acquaintance, to put it mildly, with the Second World War, I can say that not everybody dropped dead of stress from my generation. But these are young people, and they're quite early in life, who in their 20s already showed vascular systems, or had vascular systems of people who would normally expect in their 60s or in their 70s. And this is when this enormous investigation of diet began to take place. So we do need all of the efforts, we need all of the organizations, we need all of the endeavors to try to slow up this insane machine that seems to be just rolling downhill, as I said, in an ever-accelerating space. But I'd like to make a distinction between environmental issues and, if I may, ecological issues. Because there are much more deep-seated problems that are at work here than the fact that there may be greed involved. Admittedly, there is. And greed has been around for a long time. It's not peculiar to American society. You find it as much in Soviet society. It exists not only in the United States and on Wall Street, it exists in the Kremlin. So that is not the only thing that we have to be concerned with. The point is that the rate at which all of this is occurring is now producing such vast dislocations but we have to question the way in which we relate to the natural world, the whole totality of the natural world. There is something wrong that underpins all these effects that we're trying to fight today, if we are trying to fight them at all. Many people have just given up in despair, and that is even understandable in many such cases. They feel disempowered. They feel that this machine, in fact, is getting larger to the extent that it keeps rolling downhill toward what seems to be an inevitable crash, toward the destruction or complete planet breakdown of the entire planet. At least so far as fairly complex life forms are concerned, and that includes us. So I would like to look at the ecological problem, not only the environmental problem. I would like to ask a basic question. Where did we get the notion that we can dominate nature, which is so fundamental to modern thinking today? And this modern thinking is not only a form of thinking that exists in liberal ideology, it exists in socialist ideology. That is humanity's destiny, and it is the great hope of human freedom that we must first dominate the natural world. That notion, a notion, by the way, let me emphasize, not a reality. We can't dominate the natural world. That's impossible. It's all around us. It's like asking us to lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps. In some sense, everything is nature, including the electric apparatus that's right now recording what I'm saying to you about this whole issue. But the notion of dominating nature, where did that come from? And here, I think, the problem that we have to search into is a social problem. I don't think it's a question simply of technology, because that notion has been around for quite a while. One reads it, for example, in biblical literature. One reads it in all the great religions, including Chinese religion, contrary to what many people think. One finds it a very widespread ideology, a way of thinking, and one finds it not only among traditional belief systems, but among fairly modern ones. One of the most important concepts of Marx was that we had to dominate nature in order to emancipate human beings. That the domination of nature was a precondition for emancipating people from natural law, from the compelling necessity that nature imposed on us. And that is part of liberal thinking as well. And conservative thinking just very frequently takes it for granted. You just got to go ahead and grow. You got to dominate the natural world. Where does this notion come from? And my point is, and that's why I hold the views that I hold, social ecology, is that we have to look into society itself to see where this notion appears. It is not a notion that we find widespread among so-called primitive or illiterate people. However, harmoniously or inharmoniously, they live with the natural world. And they sometimes live in rather flat and sharp contradiction with the natural world. Let's not kid ourselves. It isn't all we all love nature. I mean, one can deduce beautiful examples from the mythologies, from the literature, from the anthropological reports of so-called, I always use the word so-called if it's okay to do, primitive peoples living in harmony with their environment. But they've also been known to live in disharmony with their environment. However, they did not have the notion, and they did not see it as an ideal that nature should be done. That's the idea of dominating nature. That notion I begin to find when I begin to explore societies, including fairly developed and highly institutionalized private societies in which human beings dominate other human beings. The idea of dominating nature, in other words, is very closely associated with the emergence of the domination of human by human. And one can begin to see this if one wants to try to create some type of meaningful sequence over past times in the attempts early on of elderly people who felt very insecure in tribal societies to establish what could be called gerontocracies. and begin to establish systems of domination over younger people. And I'm an old person. I stand in shock and militant defense of the right to the elderly and even to survive as an elderly person. But going back in time, I can first begin to see evidence of the insecure elderly whose powers are beginning to fail in a demanding society, already beginning to dominate young people. And the one thing about that system of domination, good or bad, is that if you live long enough, you ultimately become one of the old people who is doing part of the dominating. So it's a kind of curious democracy of domination, so to speak. The situation begins to get very sinister, however, when you begin to see increasingly the male sphere of social power, namely that which has to do with something that approximates what we would today call politics. Treaty making between communities, come to understandings about hunting and hunting grounds, wars that begin to emerge due to many different reasons that we can explore if you're interested. We begin to see also the male moving increasingly into the female domestic sphere, which is very strategic in early societies, because the real center of these early societies is the woman's heart, so to speak. It is the heart that the heart and the responsibilities of rearing children and of taking care of a good deal of the food supply. Even in many hunting communities, 80% of the biomass that constitutes the food consists of stuff, vegetable stuff, picked by women, plant foods. However much you may call it a animal protein-oriented society, due to the fact that you have male hunters who bring in the most concentrated forms of protein, or animal protein. And you begin to see this male system gradually edging in, not with a view initially toward domination, but by sheer specific weight, it begins to outweigh the position of the woman's sphere, and already elements of command begin to appear. This becomes very marked when warrior societies begin to emerge out of hunting. Not that all hunting by any means must lead to war, quite to the contrary. Early hunting societies are believed to have been extraordinarily pacific, not war-oriented. But it is not very difficult to go from hunting animals to hunting people. And that is the first step toward warfare. And there are a lot of considerations that enter into the possibility of how that transition may have taken place. But we begin to see systems of hierarchy emerging, and systems of command and obedience based on domination. Most of us, because we live in a market society, and no matter whether it is a hot issue today or not, recognize that there are classes that also begin to emerge. These center around not so much status, but really around the exploitation of labor. So that you begin to see, first of all, a landscape of hierarchy, social in nature, beginning to emerge, and then out of that you begin to see class societies based on who owns what and who works for who beginning to emerge. And that begins also to encompass that whole hierarchical order. And bit by bit, as one moves into the so-called high civilizations of the ancient world, such as ancient Egypt, such as the Mediterranean civilizations, Mesopotamia, and yes, the slavery of Greece, one begins to see the emergence of patriarchy in many of these societies. Outright patriarchy, where the eldest male is the commanding figure of both the young men and the young women, not only the women alone. Patriarchy, by the way, is not simply the domination of women. In the true sense of the word, and in the old biblical sense of the word, it is the domination by the oldest male, often in association with the oldest female, deciding what young people are going to do in the family, be they male or female. And then you begin to see, with the elaboration of these classes and with urban society, the idea not only of dominating people and of hierarchy being the natural order of things, but we begin to project that onto the natural world. We begin to speak of the lion as a king of the beasts. which no such lion obviously regards itself to be. And we speak of a Queen Anne, and we talk of slave this and that. And we begin by our very language and through our very sensibilities to look at the world, to use modern parlance, on an order of 1 to 10. Everything is hierarchically. And once this begins to really settle into society, and once this begins to really settle into our thinking, it becomes projected out on the natural world itself. There too we begin to see hierarchy everywhere. We see that we are supposed to be even superior to the so-called kingdoms of the East. We raise our own kings with lions, as it were, sculpted next to them. And we begin to form all these visions of a natural order based on domination and structured around hierarchy. But what finally begins to really crack this whole knot, what finally begins to make what is essentially a local phenomenon, such as might occur in the Nile River, or such as might have occurred in the Tigris and Euphrates River, or such as might have occurred on the hills of ancient Greece, or the broad lands that later became the latifundial lands or plantation lands of ancient Rome, and the feudal system, which led to the development of hierarchical structures on a very elaborate scale throughout Europe. What finally begins to crack this nut wide open, literally turning it into an explosive force, is the emergence of a market economy. Most of the other economies are not essentially market economies. What gives you prestige in the so-called primitive world, what gives you standing and social status, quite aside from your blood lineage and so on, such as the confirmed nobility economy, in the ancient and even in the medieval world, is your willingness to give. The greatest human attribute, what produces what is called in quotes in anthropology, the big man, is your ability to vest yourself with possessions. This reaches its very extreme form in the potlatch ceremonies of the Northwest Indies, where there is veritable competition under the influence of European competitive values, but a veritable competition not to accumulate, but to disaccumulate. You shame your opponent in such a ceremony by giving away more than he can. And he therefore becomes very shamed, guilt-ridden, and in some cases has been known to commit suicide. One of the major features, therefore, of the free market economies, whether it was actually practiced or honored in the breach, was the idea basically that, to use an old maxim, it's better to give than to receive, and which is ingrained itself as a value in the Western Christian tradition. And it's less of that an actual fact. And a second very important aspect of all free market societies is that cooperation, not competition, is the real source of progress. And that too has been emphasized over and over again in the literature of the past. Admittedly, there were personal rivalries, we can read about these in Homer, but they were mainly attempts to gain status. And the all-important thing was after you did have status, you were generous. You gave things away. And the most important thing that was emphasized among the early civilizations, even the Greek city-states themselves, was that cooperation is the real source of progress by people working together. Even if only within their own communities, you can have progress. So that even though you have hierarchy, and even though you have domination, and even though you have classes, and even though you have this extra unique phenomenon called the state, which is really the professional monopoly of violence on the part of military and on the part of bureaucrats and on the part of monarchs and the like, over the rest of the population. No matter whose interests they serve, and sometimes they only serve their own interests, the point is that cooperation remains the criterion for progress. In fact, I just recently been reading into the English Revolution, and I'm reminded, this is the one around Cromwell's time, I'm reminded of the extent to which the monarchy at that time opposed land enclosures and enacted legislation to prevent landlords from kicking off tenants or bringing common land that was once shared by an entire community into their own private estates for the purposes of sheep raising. I'm reminded even of attempts on the part of pre-capitalist societies to discourage certain technologies which would make people unemployed. In fact, the steam engine was known thousands of years ago, but it seems not to have occurred, given the mentality of the time, that it should be used for anything other than opening temple doors in order to puzzle large crowds when they open by themselves, or used to play organs. But not used, actually, even though it was known, and even though many other technologies were known that we associate with the Industrial Revolution, not used to displace labor, if only to preserve the stability of a traditional society. For whatever reason, however, and particularly in England, a system that had been around but mainly marginal to the rest of this basic domestic society and this basically cooperative society, and I don't want to make it seem more ideal than it is, it had a hell of a lot of bad features. But still, the ideal, and these ideals in particular, even where there existed a notion to dominate nature, that this kind of world was really the exemplar of progress, we began to see the emergence crashing through England and then spreading through much of Western Europe and the United States of a very opposite series of conceptions, and going at work at this particular time, or working away and eating away this traditional society that I described, an entirely new idea of what constituted progress. The first thing that was said, and not simply said, but initially it was practiced before it was said, is that what we need is healthy competition. What really makes the earth turn round, socially speaking, what pushes us out of animality, what advances us into civilization, to use Mark Twain's pronunciation of the word, good old civilization is healthy competition. Free trade. Rugged individualism. I love all the adjectives that are continually put in front of me. Being rugged is to be individualistic. Being free is to engage in trade. Where before the gift was emphasized, now a new value emerged, the bargain, which is to say somebody tries to cheat somebody in a buyer-seller relationship. And the importance of competition became not simply a moral ideal. It emerged not simply as a standard by which to gauge or to explain progress. It became literally, as an organized system, a matter of actual survival. When finally the market became sufficiently deep-seated, when it became sufficiently widespread, then you have to grow or you will die in the healthy competition of the marketplace. And we see this today almost everywhere. Not cooperation, except on Sundays perhaps, or on patriotic holidays, or during the religious events, but competition. And not only competition, but grow or die. With the result that not simply values, but a whole uncontrollable system, that very machine that I'm talking about, that seems to be rolling downhill at never increasing momentum, began to take hold of society and in fact finally became society. Even when I was young, it was possible to leave that market economy in society, and retreat into a fairly pre-industrial society of extended families, of family farms, of a broad system of relationships, of real neighborhoods and real towns in which there was a very deep sense of community. And it is especially since the 1950s, I might say, this comes from my lived experience, that this economy of grow or die, compete and in the struggle for competition succeed or be destroyed.